This is the struggle for succession, part two. This is the story of years after Alexander the Great's death and the struggle amongst the diadochoi, the so-called successors, for power and supremacy in his conquest. We're going to start with Antigonus. Antigonus the One-Eyed is sent to hunt down Eumenes, who had been the ally of Perdiccas. And Perdiccas by this point had been assassinated, probably by Ptolemy, and among the assassins was Seleucus. So Ptolemy and Seleucus will continue to play an important role. Perdiccas has been assassinated, and Eumenes is being hunted by Antigonus. Antigonus expels Eumenes from Cappadocia, so he moves him out of the region that he was in. But then Antipater suddenly dies in 319. And Antipater had taken over the role that Perdiccas had held. He had been the regent for the two kings that were holding the throne at this point, Alexander IV, the baby, and Philip III, or Philip Aridaeus, who was mentally incompetent, possibly because he had been poisoned by Alexander the Great's mother when he was young. So Antipater had been acting as regent, and he dies suddenly in 319. Now there's a new opportunity for a struggle for power. Antipater's son Cassander takes over an important role in this struggle. He allies himself with Antigonus and Ptolemy and Lysimachus. They ally themselves against the replacement of Antipater, who is Polyperchon. Antipater chose Polyperchon over his own son Cassander. This is the reason why Cassander revolts. And Polyperchon allies with Eumenes and Alexander's mother, Olympias. So keep all these names straight. This is Alexander the Great's mother. Ptolemy is holding power in Egypt right now, but he's not an independent king. He's still acting under the guidance of Antipater, and when Antipater dies, there's a new struggle for power. Antigonus is one of the more powerful of these successors who are struggling for power. He's the one on the hunt for Eumenes, and he's the one that has control mostly of Asia at this point. Lysimachus is located in Thrace, which is north of Greece, next to Macedon. And right now you have Eumenes, who was formerly allied with Perdiccas, who is now assassinated, allying himself with Alexander's mother and Antipater's named heir, Polyperchon. So there's a struggle for about 3 years among these factions. Philip III, Philip Aridaeus, and his queen are murdered by Olympias in 317. She returns from her kingdom of Epirus, which we'll hear about again, which is to the west of Macedon, north of Greece, and to the west of Macedon. And she has Philip III and his queen murdered in 317. The Macedonian aristocracy, however, rallies to Cassander. Cassander, who is the son of Antipater. Antipater had been running the kingdom on behalf of the two kings. The Macedonian aristocracy does not rally to Olympias, that's Alexander's mother, or Alexander's infant son. He's a little bit older now. Shouldn't say he's still an infant, Alexander IV. Cassander, who was fighting Polyperchon in the Peloponnesus, returns to Macedon and has Olympias murdered. A lot of typos with the name Olympias. That's Alexander the Great's mother. Then Cassander assumes control of Macedon, and he still claims to be regent for the child Alexander IV, the son of Alexander the Great. So it's a lot to keep track of, but just think about the upshot of everything that's going on here. After Antipater dies, Cassander, his son, takes control. He's fighting against Alexander the Great's mother and essentially against Alexander the Great's son. He has allies that hold powerful positions like Ptolemy in Egypt and Antigonus in Asia, or the Middle East really is what you'd call it today. So Cassander assumes control of Macedon. He claims to be the regent of Alexander IV, but really is probably consolidating power for himself. Alexander IV, the baby, the child, and Alexander's wife from Afghanistan, Roxanne, are put under house arrest and they're never seen again. The Argead house that Alexander's family comes from, that Philip II, Philip the One-Eyed, came from, is now extinct. The family that basically built Macedon into the greatness that it is has now been nullified. That dynasty is done. Antigonus finally catches up with the Eumenes in 316. He gets rid of Eumenes. He nullifies Eumenes. Eumenes is out of the picture now. Antigonus appoints his friends as satraps in key places, even though he's not really running the show as regent or like the way Cassander is. Antigonus is assuming a lot of power right now. And Seleucus, who had been the assassin of Perdiccas, Seleucus abandons Babylon and flees to Ptolemy in Egypt. At this point, Seleucus fears Antigonus, who had started to execute his competitors and rivals and basically anyone in authority. So Antigonus is grabbing up power, and he will continue to be strong and grab up power. Eventually, Cassander will not be important because Antigonus will take over the kingdom. Right now, Cassander is still in control. Antigonus, though, is grabbing a lot of power. Seleucus, who in the long term will be a survivor, flees to Ptolemy, and the two are allied. Cassander now controls Macedon and the European Greeks, and Antigonus controls Asia. Again, the break between these successors is getting stronger and stronger, especially now that Alexander's child and Philip Aridaeus are out of the picture. The next phase in the story could be referred to as the fall of Antigonus. At this point, Antigonus seems to want a united empire under his rule, and he makes a plan to invade Macedon in 315 BC. He is resisted at this point by Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus. Ptolemy is in Egypt. Seleucus was in Babylon, in the Middle East, you would call it today. Cassander right now holds power in Macedon, ostensibly, and over the Greeks. And Lysimachus is still allied to them. And Lysimachus never gains great power. That's why I never put his name in bold. But he's still in the game at this point. Here's a theme that we revisited again and again in this class as we see the Romans get in the picture and the Macedonians continue to struggle. Antigonus, the One-Eyed, declares all the Greek cities to be free, autonomous, and removes any garrison. He doesn't really have the authority to do this in Greece because Cassander's in control. It's really just propaganda. He's telling the Greeks what they want to hear, and they love freedom. He's trying to turn them against Cassander. And what unfolds next is that Antigonus and Ptolemy in Egypt skirmish for a few years, and finally a major battle occurs. Ptolemy from Egypt defeats Antigonus' son, Demetrius Poliorcetes, Demetrius the Besieger, at Gaza in 312 BC. At this point, Seleucus feels safe enough to return to Babylon. In 311, Antigonus makes peace with his former allies. He had been allies with them, then he was enemies with them, and now he's trying to be allies with them again. So Antigonus makes peace with Ptolemy, Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon. They retain their satrapies, they retain their governorship of local areas. Lysimachus retains his area, his governorship, and Cassander remains strategos, essentially, general, in Macedon and over Greece. Antigonus remains the ostensible leader of most of what they're calling Asia or the Middle East. That's also where Seleucus is located, but Antigonus has much more of the army, much more power and influence than Seleucus has at this point. All of these players, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Antigonus, emphasize that the Greeks are free. They're all trying to win the loyalty of the Greeks. The Greeks aren't strong independently. Athens as a city itself is nothing compared to these kingdoms. Sparta isn't powerful anymore. But as a whole, they still pose a threat, and the Macedonians who are struggling to control Alexander's conquest need the help of these Greeks. In 307, Demetrius Poliorcetes, the son of Antigonus the One-Eyed, invades Greece and quote-unquote frees Athens from Cassander's rule, seizes the island of Salamis, and defeats Ptolemy's fleet the next year in 306. At this point, Athens had been governed by a philosopher named Demetrius of Phaleron. He fled to Egypt and helped Ptolemy establish the library and museum, the really first research library and first so-called museum, which means place of the muses. That's a topic for another lecture. The greatness of the library and museum changed the world that you live in even to this day. It's one of the greatest achievements of humankind. So this former governor of Athens, Demetrius of Phaleron, is largely responsible for the foundation of this brilliant research complex. It's very much like what a modern university is. You might not think of a library and museum as the key elements of a modern university, but if you break down what the ancient library and museum did, it's very much what a modern university does. They do research, and they have record of all the previous research. At this point, Demetrius Poliorcetes unsuccessfully, by the way, besieges, that's where he gets his name, the besieger, the island of Rhodes. So he gets his ironic name, the besieger. And the Rhodians, the people from the island of Rhodes, erect their colossal statue of Helios in thanksgiving for saving them from Demetrius Poliorcetes. This is known as one of the seven wonders of the world, this gigantic statue that stood astride the harbor in Rhodes. And no record of it, no remains of it are left to this day. It's amazing that such a gigantic statue would just appear into thin air. But in the ancient world, this is considered one of the seven wonders. At this point, Demetrius returns to mainland Greece to drive out Cassander, or attempt to. He occupies the Parthenon in Athens in 304 with his mistress, who happens to be a prostitute. And this is pretty strange. He's living in one of the greatest temples in the Greek world, one of the most sacred places in all of Greece, with his prostitute mistress. Demetrius is probably not making a lot of friends in Athens by doing so. He tries and does revive something like the League of Corinth, an alliance including Corinth, and he's taking the Greeks, the mainland Greeks, and allying a lot of them into an alliance that's directed against Cassander. He's trying to use the Greeks against Cassander's power base in Macedon. Now, at this point, you can safely say that this whole charade, this whole false pretense of a united empire ends. Demetrius, the son of Antigonus, and Antigonus himself are proclaimed kings, since, after all, Alexander IV, the baby king, son of Alexander, is gone, as is Philip Aridaeus. They're proclaimed kings, and all the other generals and satraps follow suit. Ptolemy, Seleucus, everyone now forgets about this idea of trying to work together or pretending to work together. Now they all want to be king of their little domain. There's no more regency. Alexander IV has probably been killed at this point by Cassander. Alexander also had an illegitimate son named Heracles. He's been killed by Cassander. And the regent, Polyperchon, has retired into obscurity. He's never seen from again. He probably rightly gets out of this game because it would mean his death. It's every man for himself now. Antigonus moves north to challenge Cassander in Macedon, and Cassander surrenders. But Cassander appeals to Ptolemy and Seleucus and Lysimachus, and they all join against Antigonus the One-Eyed and Antigonus' attempt to rule the whole empire by himself. The next thing that happens is among the most important things. In 301, Lysimachus, Seleucus defeat Antigonus and his son Demetrius at Ipsus, the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC. Ipsus, I should have put this in bold, the Battle of Ipsus is among the most important in this long struggle for supremacy among the diadochoi, the successors of Alexander. Antigonus, at this point, was over 80 years old, hugely obese, but he nonetheless fights in the battle and is trampled to death by Seleucus' elephants Demetrius escapes and he's on the run. Just as a side note, that's the way that I want to die. Over 80 years old, hugely fat, fighting in hand-to-hand combat and trampled by elephants. The most dangerous of the diadochoi has now been eliminated, Antigonus the One-Eyed. His son is still on the run, but it's good news that Antigonus is down as far as anyone else is concerned. Lysimachus then gets most of Asia Minor, that's modern Turkey. Cassander consolidates his control of the Greek mainland and Macedon. And Seleucus gets Syria and Mesopotamia, this is modern Iraq and modern Syria, the Middle East, though this does bring him to conflict with Ptolemy. Seleucus and Ptolemy had been allies, and yet at this point, when it comes down to it and they're fighting over supremacy, their little domains, Ptolemy is willing to fight Seleucus and vice versa. No treaty is sacred among these diadochoi. In 301, after this battle of Ipsus, Ptolemy allies with Lysimachus and Seleucus now. Ptolemy allies with Lysimachus, and Seleucus allies with Demetrius, the son of Antigonus. These former enemies, Seleucus and Demetrius, are now allies. And Demetrius at this point is ruling a kind of sea empire, almost like pirates. He's got some port cities and a pretty big navy. Not really the same thing that Seleucus is able to muster, and certainly not the strong kingdom that Ptolemy is developing down in Egypt. But nonetheless, he allies himself with Seleucus, and Ptolemy and Lysimachus are going to fight over their territories. Ptolemy, since he does not trust Demetrius so much, asks for him to send him a hostage, and he sends him Pyrrhus, who will become later famous from Roman history and from the term that's still used in English today for a Pyrrhic victory. It's a victory where you lose almost as much as you win, or sometimes even lose more than you win. It's like not really a victory. Pyrrhus is related to Alexander the Great. He's from Epirus, which is the same place that Alexander the Great's mother is from. And he is a wild and crazy guy, a fascinating life to read about. You'll hear more about him later in the class. He's already been exiled twice from his homeland, where he is or was king. He has a strange relationship with his home kingdom. Ptolemy does something for Pyrrhus to gain his long-term friendship, and he restores him to his throne, since he had been kicked out, and now we move into the final struggle for supremacy. Cassander dies in 298. All of a sudden, he's dead, and his sons, they can't even get along in the same family. His sons break out in civil war, struggling for supremacy even among one family. Demetrius Poliorcetes takes advantage of this civil war. He seizes Athens, tries to get them on his side. He seized Macedon from the feuding sons of Cassander, and he's proclaimed king of Macedon. He becomes Demetrius I of Macedon for a short time. However, the other diadochoi, always ready to respond, always itching for a fight, they, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Seleucus all unite against Demetrius. Demetrius made some gains, and he's about to have them taken away. Ptolemy convinces his former hostage, who's now back to being king of Epirus, to join them in this alliance, and they move against Demetrius. By 287, Pyrrhus and Lysimachus have invaded Macedon, and Demetrius has to flee. And then Pyrrhus and Lysimachus divide Macedon between them. Not really finding any great solutions here, just a lot of moving around, a lot of moving of power, nothing very stable. Again, Ptolemy is pretty stable. Lysimachus has been pretty stable for a long time. Seleucus is starting to get some kind of stability where he is. But generally speaking, there's a lot of movement here, not a lot of stability. But Demetrius is a fighter. He rallies. He makes a deal with Athens. He leaves his son Antigonus Gonatus, which means something like knock-knees, to hold the line in Greece while he tries to invade Asia Minor. He had fled from Macedon, but now he gathers up an army, leaves his son in Athens, and he tries to invade Asia Minor to Turkey, modern Turkey. In 286, he invades Asia through Turkey, and he has initial successes, but he's finally captured by Seleucus in 285. So Demetrius, captured by Seleucus in 285, lives out his days in house arrest bored, apparently. At one point, Seleucus allows him allegedly to drink himself to death, and he does so in 283 BC. Ptolemy, the only one of Alexander's generals besides Antipater to die of natural causes, also dies in 283. But Ptolemy has a well-established kingdom at this point in Egypt. And don't forget about Antigonus Gonatas, the son of Demetrius Poliorcetes and the grandson of Antigonus the One-Eyed. He's still back in Greece. Ptolemy sets up a succession of his son, who's named Ptolemy II, Ptolemy Philadelphus, which means brotherly love or sisterly love, because there is a tradition in this Ptolemaic empire to marry close relatives, including sisters, including nieces, including half-sisters, and so forth and so on. There is an elder boy in this family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy Keraunos, which means something like Ptolemy the Thunderbolt. Don't forget about him. He'll come up in a minute. Ptolemy Keraunos leaves Egypt smartly because there's a struggle for family power. He gets out of there because he'll probably be killed if he stays. He'll probably be murdered by his brother if he stays. He attaches himself to Seleucus over in central, the Middle East, really, in Syria, what's modern Syria. And again, nothing is sacred, no treaty is forever among these people, nothing lasts. Seleucus invades Lysimachus's kingdom in Thrace. They meet at the Battle of Coropedium, which means the Field of Crows, in 281 BC. Both generals are over 80 years old at this point, still struggling for this power. Seleucus wins. It's interesting. Does this mean that empire is finally united? Alexander the Great's conquest. After decades of struggle, it kind of is united. Is it time for him to rest? He is the last man standing. Perdiccas, who had been the regent of Alexander IV and Philip Aridaeus, is dead. Eumenes is long dead. Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, is dead. And the infant son of Alexander is dead. And Philip Aridaeus, we just mentioned, is dead. And Heracles, the bastard son of Alexander, is dead. The whole Argead dynasty is gone. Antipater, who had taken over for Perdiccas, is now dead. And his son Cassander is dead. And Polyperchon is retired and dead at this point. Antigonus the One-Eyed is dead, trampled to death on the battlefield. His son Demetrius has drunken himself to death. Ptolemy the First is even dead, and Lysimachus is dead. The only one left is Seleucus, over 80 years old. He wins, right? Who can possibly challenge him at this point? I told you to remember Ptolemy Keraunos, the Thunderbolt. Like a thunderbolt, he comes out of nowhere and assassinates Seleucus. The guy made it to over 80 years old. He won the struggle of the diadochoi, and he's killed by this unwanted eldest Ptolemaic son. He had been taken in by Seleucus, and then he murders his host. Nothing is sacred among these royal families struggling. He does something strange. He lures Lysimachus's widow, Arsinoe, who is also his own half-sister, into marrying him. That's a strange one, to marry your half-sister. And he kills her two remaining children. She escapes, and you will hear more from her if we had more time. She doesn't go away. She escapes from this kind of mistaken marriage, or this trap that she fell into by marrying her half-brother. And you'll see how things turn out. She continues her intrigue. Seleucus had wisely appointed an heir before the Battle of Coropedium, his son Antiochus I. So in Egypt with the Ptolemies and in Asia with the Seleucids, they established somewhat stable dynasties, at least with a stable succession plan. This isn't true in Macedonia and Greece. Remember, Antigonus the Knock-Kneed is in Macedonia and Greece, but all these other families don't really have a stable dynasty yet. Egypt, with the Ptolemies, has a stable new king. the Middle East, Syria, Mesopotamia as a stable succession. In 280, there's another surprise. There's a massive migration of Celts. This is largely because Seleucus diverted his troops to Corypedium, away from his northern defenses, opening up this way for the Celts to move into this Macedonian, Greek kingdom. In 279, Ptolemy Ceraunus dies defending Macedon against the Gauls. No great loss there. The Gauls had been migrating now for quite some time. And by defending Macedon, Ceraunus dies. In a gruesome detail, the Gauls take his severed head and carry it on a pike as they go through, marauding throughout the land in Thrace, Asia Minor, and throughout the Balkans. The Celts, caused them trouble for quite some time. But the Gauls are finally defeated by the Aetolian League. This is an alliance of cities in the northwest of Greece, just south of Epirus, where Pyrrhus comes from and where Olympias, Alexander the Great's mother, came from. And then in another battle in 277, Antigonus the Knock-kneed, remember, who had been left in Greece, the son of Demetrius Poliorcetes and the grandson of Antigonus One-Eyed, also defeats the Celts, or the Gauls. Just so you know, the Celts and the Gauls are two names for the same people. As a result, the Aetolian League emerges as a dominant power in central Greece. So you've got an independent Greek alliance, revived Greek power. Antigonus the Knock-kneed, Antigonus Gonatas, becomes king of Macedon, and this dynasty will continue until 168 BC. From 279 to 168, Antigonus's grandson, the son of Demetrius Poliorcetes, the besieger, founds this dynasty, and it has stability in Macedon all the way to 168, about a 100-year dynasty. Not too bad. But if you look at the other dynasties that are established among Alexander the Great's successors, it's in fourth place. It does the worst. 100 years is not bad, but it's not the best. The Aetolian League holds its own in central Greece, remains independent. The Achaean League builds up and holds its own in the Peloponnesus. It includes most of the cities down there except for Sparta. The Aetolian League and the Achaean League get independent recognition from the Macedonian kingdoms: Egypt, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Antigonids up in Macedon. They're nearly equals during this century. During the 3rd century, the Greeks hold their own one last time. Then what they do is they ally themselves with Rome against Macedon. When Rome has its eyes on Macedon, they enlist the Achaean League and the Aetolian League, and Rome tricks them. Rome pretends to be their friend. They tell them, Greeks, you're free. Help us defeat Macedon. The Greeks help them defeat Macedon, and then the Romans conquer them. Nothing is sacred. These silly Greeks, the Aetolian League is conquered by 189 BC, the Achaean League by 146 BC, and now Rome takes Greece. By 168, they had taken Macedon. 189, the Aetolian League, 169, Macedon, and 146, the Achaean League, including Corinth. James Madison, by the way, as a side note, studied these leagues as possible models for new federal states, as did the French political theorist Montesquieu. Some of the government of the United States is based on the way these Achaean and Aetolian leagues were run. On a less impressive note, Sparta is down to only about 1,000 citizens at this point. Spartiati, full-blooded. They do have a few military successes in spite of their low numbers, but Macedon and the Achaean League crushed them in a battle in 222 BC. That's really the last time you hear anything about Sparta. Ptolemy reigns in power in Egypt, Ptolemy II. That dynasty lasts from all the way down to 31 BC. So from about 321 to 31 BC, about 300 years of power for that dynasty. Seleucus' dynasty, that's first place. They last the longest of all the successor kingdoms, the diadochoi. Seleucus' kingdom remains in place until 63 BC, from about 321 to 63. They're second place as far as longevity. Third place are the Attalids of Pergamum. We have not mentioned them yet. They come into being around 263 and last until about 133. This kingdom is carved out rather sneakily. It's just a city-state, really, but they acquire a vast amount of wealth. There's a fortress in Pergamum, which is a city not really near the coast of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, on the Aegean Sea. It collected 9,000 talents. It's run by a eunuch who was really under the control of Lysimachus. This eunuch rules this part of Asia Minor for Lysimachus, and he hoards lots of money, and he slowly carves out a little niche for himself, a little kingdom for himself. And as always, there's bloody scheming intrigue among these royal families. It's instigated within Lysimachus' family by his wife and the eunuch, whose name is Philortaeus, in 282 to defect to Seleucus. So what happens is Seleucus at once marches into Asia Minor, defeats Lysimachus with the help of this eunuch and Lysimachus' own wife. They defect to Seleucus. Seleucus marches in Asia Minor, defeats Lysimachus, and then Philortaeus purchases the corpse of Seleucus, who's killed later in that year, from his murderer Ptolemy Caranus. Remember that, he was the last man standing, Seleucus, and then he's murdered by the thunderbolt. And he sends the ashes to his victim's son and successor, Antiochus I. I don't know if that's supposed to be a friendly gesture or not, but that's what he did. What he does then is he mints coins in the name of Lysimachus, whom he had betrayed, and subsequently in the name of Seleucus, later using the image of Seleucus, but his own name. So this is a crafty fellow. He's using propaganda, he's using imagery, he's using money, he's using internal palace intrigue, he's turning wives against husbands. This Philortaeus carves out his little kingdom in Pergamum, and then under the kind of dominance now, not of Lysimachus anymore, but under Seleucid dynasty influence, Philortaeus rules Pergamum as kind of local governor, and surrounding territory, the city and the surrounding territory, and then he adopts his nephew Attalus, whom he marries off to Antiochus, the daughter of a guy named Achaeus and Eumenes. Remember Eumenes back from the beginning of this struggle. So he's making very careful alliances, this Philortaeus, in his little kingdom that he's slowly carving out for himself. Technically, he was under Lysimachus' power, but then he betrayed Lysimachus and moved to Seleucus, and now he's slowly carving out his own little dynasty in this city-state. He founds this little dynasty once he adopts his nephew, since he was a eunuch and couldn't have children, and he spends a lot of money in Greek cities, and he makes donations. And he gains, therefore, alliances by throwing that money that he hoarded around. 9,000 talents is an enormous sum of money. It's as rich as any of these other states were at that point. He somehow knows how to manage money and collects enough money to build a giant mercenary army and to give gifts to other cities. He gets the nickname of the good doer, the good deed doer, because he gives all this money to these Greek cities. So here's the summary of death and destruction. Macedon, along with the Achaean League, crushes Sparta in 222 BC. The Achaean League, in turn, is crushed by Rome in 146, and Rome crushes the Aetolian League in 189. The Antigonid dynasty, founded really not by Antigonus the One-Eyed or his son Demetrius, but by his grandson, Antigonus the Knock-Kneed, Antigonus Gonatas, The last king of that dynasty was vanquished by Rome in 168 at the Battle of Pydna. They went from 277 to about 160 to about 277 to 168. Antigonus the Knock-kneed, the grandson of Antigonus the One-eyed, and the son of Demetrius Poliorcetes. And the Attalids, the ones in Pergamum that carved out that sneaky little kingdom, they're given by the Attalus III in his will. When he dies, he says, Rome, you can just have the kingdom. They go from about 263 to 133 BC. When he dies, in his will it says Rome can take over us. In other words, he doesn't want to fight. He knows it's a done deal. Rome is going to conquer the whole region. Why not make it peaceful? This is really what starts the Roman Revolution, by the way. 133 BC to 33 is the date that we're going to put, to 31 BC is when we put the Roman Revolution. The ultimate origins of this Attalid dynasty is Philotaeus, who adopted his nephew, who becomes Eumenes I. He's really the first independent ruler. He was under the control of Lysimachus, then under the control of Seleucus, but then by the time his nephew takes power, it is an independent kingdom. And then finally the Seleucids, they rule from about 321 to 63 when the Roman general Pompey undertakes a final suppression of the Seleucid dynasty. The Romans come in about 64, 63, the conquest is over. Pompey, who's a military genius, conquers the Seleucids. Athens falls to Sulla. They maintain some pretense of being free and independent. About 88 to 87 BC, Sulla comes in and sacks that city, makes sure they know that Rome controls them as well. And then the Ptolemies last the longest. 31 BC, Octavian, who later becomes called Augustus, conquers the city of Alexandria in Egypt, and Rome assumes control of Egypt. The total length of their dynasty is somewhere from around the death of Alexander to 31 BC. Ptolemy doesn't take over immediately, but somewhere in that range, Ptolemy is living and establishing his power base in Egypt.